Good evening. I'm Mary Watson, Executive Dean at the New School, and it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you tonight to tonight's event as part of a 12-year partnership with the Nation Institute and Nation Books. The New School has long been a home to scholars and activists and intellectuals and journalists, all of whom are actively and passionately advocating for a socially just world. Founded in 1919, our university has always been a different kind of institution, one where the faculty and students and staff work on issues of deep importance to them and are encouraged to freely discuss and debate and, dare I say, confront and address pressing social issues. And so that's what makes this partnership with the Nation Institute and Nation Books so exciting. And tonight, to add to that continued long legacy of 100 years of activities, we welcome and celebrate the release of Nation journalist Sarah Jaffe's book, Necessary Trouble, Americans in Revolt. Jaffe is a Nation Institute Fellow, a journalist, rabble-rouser, and co-host of Dissent Magazine's Belabored podcast. And she writes on politics, labor, and social movements and pop culture. It's been published in the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and of course, The Nation, among many other publications. And she's currently a staff writer at the publication in these times. Joining Sarah tonight is Laura Flanders, best-selling author and broadcaster, founder of the Laura Flanders Show and Grit TV. Laura can be seen every week on cable, satellite TV, and various venues on the internet. Flanders is also a contributing writer at The Nation and Yes Magazine's columns. So just to give a few comments about the context of Sarah's book tonight, so I make a few observations about the thesis of the book and what we're seeing. Some would say we are witnessing a moment of unprecedented political engagement and social activism. I might say that while it's unprecedented, it's not clear what the political engagement and social activism is about sometimes, and it appears more to me in some venues as a spectacle as opposed to an engagement, but we can debate that later. And while pundits continue to fret about how Americans are so apathetic, we have seen significant protests and actions across the country. For example, the growth of the Tea Party, the successful fight for the $15 minimum wage, the Black Lives Matter movement, Occupy Wall Street, the networks that supported presidential candidates like Bernie Sanders and others. So in her book, Necessary Trouble, Jaffe shows us that Americans across the political spectrum are really boldly challenging who and what wields power in this country. They are therefore poised to permanently remake politics as we know it. In some cases they have, and we might say there's quite a ways to go. So won't you join me in welcoming back to the New School Sarah Jaffe and Laura Flanders. Welcome.
Sarah and I know each other for a few years. There was a time in about 2009, I think, when I was looking for a writer and social media person for the daily TV show I was doing called Grit TV. And suddenly, my email box filled up with one name, coming from all sorts of people I didn't even know. This is the person for you. And no wonder. The show Grit TV was a daily program that, we covered the world as if movements mattered, as if women and people of color were serious leaders and equal humans, and we gave meaningful attention to those who we believed were making radical change in this country. I was looking for a writer who was smart and could write to deadline and had an attitude. Sarah. On top of that, she loved David Bowie, and we have a similar fondness for shoes.
See?
She knows how to have a good time. She's a wonderful analyst of what's happening in our world, and I couldn't be more proud and happy to see her come out with her first book, Necessary Trouble. So, Love Fest. You're going to get a lot of really critical questions here. I'm really going to rake you over the coals. Why don't you start with where the book started, perhaps? Like, what was the beginning of it for you?
I started, when I began, literally where the book begins is on Grit TV, right? Where I begin the introduction to this book was with this guy, J.D. Meadows, who was on the show because of this documentary that Rick Rowley had done on the rise of white supremacist movements under Obama. And you talk to this guy who was from Mississippi, and he's complaining about the Benchcraft plant getting closed down and moving to China and all of these things that were the same thing that we're mad about, but he's joining the Tea Party. And not only joining the Tea Party, but joining the Council of Conservative Citizens, which eventually became famous a few years later when Dylan Roof turned out to be getting his news from the Council of Conservative Citizens before he shot 9 black people in a church in Charleston, South Carolina. So we're going, why is this guy joining this horrible organization if he's mad about the same stuff we're mad about? And that stuck with me. And then, a few years later, this thing happens in a park in Lower Manhattan, and I'm going down there going, I don't know what this is going to be. This kind of probably seems like it's not going to be anything. That was Occupy Wall Street. Whoops. We all kind of thought it wasn't going to be anything at first, and turned out to be something. And that has been the story of the last 6-7 years, I think.
So why don't you go back 5 years for a moment? I mean,
Just about exactly 5 years.
Just about exactly 5 years ago, you had Occupy Wall Street sort of burbling up, word kind of burbled up from downtown, from Wall Street, that something was happening. At that time, I mean, you just sort of briefly said that you didn't immediately know the significance of it. But what not only did
I not know the significance of it immediately, I kind of was just like, why are we protesting Wall Street on a Saturday? Well, come Monday, they're still there. And yeah, I mean, there had been a lot of attempts at getting something started after 2008, right? There had been protests. There had been the Republic Windows and Doors workers who occupied their factory in Chicago. There had been, we'd covered on Grit TV, the showdown in Chicago and the showdown on Main Street and on all of those things that like National People's Action, which is now just People's Action, was trying to do. Like there were people who were trying to get something going for all that time that didn't work. And the thing that stuck was this, this thing that was like more audacious and didn't have any demands and was just gonna hold on to this space, and then like had the fortune or misfortune of managing to get 700 people arrested on the Brooklyn Bridge one day, and then people started to pay attention. And so, yeah, like looking back on it, I was just in Atlanta talking about this book at a book festival, and there were a lot of people there, very specific questions about Occupy and what Occupy accomplished and whether it accomplished anything and what happened to those people and what are they doing and who are they going to vote for in November. And I'm like, I wish I could answer all these questions. I can't answer who people are going to vote for in November. But I think that's the least interesting of all of those questions. And where those people went is all over the place into all of these different movements, but they stayed in contact with each other, and these movements stay sort of networked in a way that when you see like what's going on right now in North Dakota with these pipeline protests, people from around the country, people from Black Lives Matter are going to North Dakota, people from all sorts of different protests are going to North Dakota. I am going to North Dakota with people that I met at Occupy Wall Street next week. And so we see these things sort of all converging into this big network of people who are willing to get involved in all of these different movements, around all of these issues because they see all these issues as connected.
We say at the show, we did then and we say it now, the Laura Flanders show is a weekly show, and we talk about giving meaningful attention to marginalized experts. And what we're getting at there is that the money media have a habit of marginalizing people and then calling them marginal, yes. Of giving people a second to make a point and then saying their thoughts aren't well thought through, or saying they're single issue, of saying if you have many connected issues, that it's just a laundry list or it's diffuse.
Incoherent is a good one.
Or incoherent. What you do in this book is put back the context, put back the complexity of movement demands and movement interpretation, and also give people a chance to speak for themselves. So I wanted to just give the people here a chance who may not have read the book to hear a little bit of how you do that. Is there a part of the book you'd like to read?
Oh, there are a few, I guess. Let me think. I've been flipping back and forth with like, which bit do I want to read? Which bit do I want to read here? So Yeah, I keep going back lately, probably because I'm obsessed with this pipeline blockade in North Dakota and because I'm packing my things this weekend to go out there. I keep going back to the last chapter in the book, which is a chapter about climate change and the climate justice movement. So I guess I'm going to go there. So this is from the end of the book. Don't worry, it's not going to spoil anything. I'm not going to tell you how the revolution's going to happen. It's cool. All right. When Kieran Kanakanak first became a climate activist, she often found herself one of the only people of color in a room, sometimes a very large room. She was 19 in the middle of the 2008 presidential election. She was in college in Athens, Ohio, unsure of what she was doing when she was invited to a Sierra Club meeting. From there, she threw herself into the movement, but she still felt that something was missing. It never had a class analysis, she said. The reason why black and brown people, poor people in Appalachia need to lead this is they understand power. To tell people who are suffering daily that they need to save the planet misses the fact, she noted, that for many of them, if saving the planet doesn't include changing their lives, quote, a lot of us don't even want to live on the planet even if we could save it. The People's Climate March on Sunday, September 21st, 2014, gosh, so many anniversaries right now, huh? 2014 was designed with that lesson in mind. A massive march through New York City with the frontline communities marching in the lead, First Nations people from Canada who had been battling the tar sands, community groups from sandy-ravaged neighborhoods, delegations from around the world, was supposed to send a signal that the people of the world were tired of waiting for elite leaders to act. The march was backed by Bill McKibben's 350.org and a host of other organizations with buy-in from labor unions. Estimates put the number of participants at well over 100,000. But to get that many people at the march, noted Colin Kitteberg, an organizer with System Change, Not Climate Change, and an editor at Dissent in the House, the organizers diffused the message. Many of the signs at the march were aimed at specific polluters, called for bans on fracking or drilling, but the march overall did not make specific demands. There were thousands in town for the march, though, and organizers took advantage of that to bring a deeper analysis of the situation to the fore, as well as to take more radical action. System Change, Not Climate Change organized a convergence, a day of panels and workshops. They featured Shama Sawant, Jill Stein of the Green Party, and others digging into the politics of climate justice. Then Monday morning, a crowd of people poured into Battery Park, most of them dressed in blue, for Flood Wall Street, an action plan to disrupt the financial district and put out the message, as one massive banner read, that capitalism equals climate chaos. Many of the organizers were former occupiers, some of whom had also been paid organizers on the official People's Climate March, and were willing to face arrest to demonstrate the need for serious action on climate change. In Battery Park, they went through a brief direct action training and scribbled the National Lawyers Guild phone number on body parts. Then they took the streets. There was this incredible energy as we poured out into the streets because everyone thought we were immediately going to be battling with the cops, Kinneberg said. But instead, the police let them take the street and pen them in at the intersection around the Wall Street Bull. It very quickly turned into this carnival, Kinneberg said. There was singing, dancing, an impromptu speak out as the day stretched on. A group of protesters, including student organizer Biola Gigi, climbed onto a double-decker tourist bus and rode it around waving a blue flag. The giant inflatable carbon bubble that had been prepared by demonstrators for the climate march was passed around the crowd and was eventually popped by the police. We didn't know how to escalate because we'd already done the thing that we thought was going to get us arrested, Kinneberg laughed. But at the end of the day, he was part of a group of over 100 people who took arrest rather than leave the streets. And yeah, I think I'll stop there. And of course, we should talk about, the police were very nice to the People's Climate March and to Flood Wall Street, but that has changed rapidly in New York City since then.
There was a great picture of them arresting a polar bear.
Polar bear, yes.
So talk about that trajectory. You mentioned Shama Sawant and that. Does everybody in the room know who Shama Sawant is? Maybe just fill people in case some people don't know.
Yeah,
who is Shama Sawant?
Shama Sawant is featured in the previous chapter of the book, and she is a member of the Seattle City Council and was rather famous because she's a socialist.
She says at the end of the book that Occupy and the Fight for 15 helped feed into her electoral victories and her electoral work. But it's part of the book that you just read from that also addresses or raises that question: how do you translate sort of popular groundswell of activism and grassroots action and demonstrating into actual power, whether you interpret that as electoral power or not? Has that changed? Have you learned in the course of researching this book new things about how that is or isn't happening? What helps, what hurts?
Yeah, and I think I've learned things since the book went to press too, right? When I was writing about the Wisconsin Capitol occupation and the fact that, after all of that, after these massive, massive protests that got national attention, international attention really, that Scott Walker won a recall election, right? That he is still the governor of Wisconsin. Thankfully, he's not going to be president, but he's still the governor of Wisconsin. And then in Chicago, after a major teacher strike, after, the city really rallied around the teachers in opposition to Rahm Emanuel is still mayor of Chicago. And I thought when we were looking at that if people were going to run electoral campaigns, they really needed to find a way they needed to find people who are rooted in those movements. And Shyama comes out of that, right? She came out of Occupy in Seattle and was involved in, when the occupation in Seattle got evicted from the park it was in, moving them to the campus of the university where she taught. So that was one theory, but then after that, this summer we saw the Buy Anita campaign in Chicago, in the past year, where Anita Alvarez, who is the prosecutor who refused to prosecute police officers who were killing lots and lots of people, was removed from office, and a lot of the people who organized around that did that without endorsing her opponent. And that was why it was called the Buy Anita campaign, and there's the hashtag Buy Anita, but they very specifically sort of did it, and while doing it, put the woman who would replace her on notice that, we're not supporting you, we're just getting rid of her, and we may come for you next. And this happened also in Cleveland, which got a little bit less attention, where Timothy McGinty, who is the prosecutor who failed to, among other things, prosecute the police officer who shot 12-year-old Tamir Rice in something like 30 seconds after pulling up at a playground, where he was also removed from office, and it was the same kind of campaign. So I'm rethinking how I think about those electoral campaigns already. But I'm still, it's presidential election season, and everybody wants to ask me whether people should vote for Hillary Clinton, and I just I don't care. So I still think that there are many, many ways to wield power that don't necessarily involve electing somebody to office. And, since we're in New York, I was explaining New York to people last night. Everybody in here knows about Andrew Cuomo, right? I don't have to explain Andrew Cuomo to New York crowds. That Andrew Cuomo was vehemently opposed to a $15 an hour minimum wage right up until the moment where he wanted to take credit for it. And that doesn't happen without a movement. It also doesn't happen without him being, under the threat of possibly being indicted. But we should be real about how those things play into each other. But that's also, we should be real about that because it also allows us to know when these things are ripe for strategic interventions.
So you talked about talking about the book. What are you finding in this environment when it comes to the questions that you're asked? In 2008,
I don't want to talk about Trump.
Well, but are people? I remember I know how hard it is to talk about social movements in our contemporary media. Yeah. You've gotten the book reviewed in the New York Times. You got a piece in the Washington Post. It was a pick for the books to go to college with. I'm not envious or anything. I'm super impressed.
I'm going to give all credit for that to the wonderful people who are in this room, to my editors and publicists and all of the people at the Nation Institute and Nation Books who managed to make all that happen, because I don't know how those people wound up taking me seriously. I'm a weirdo person who reports on labor and social movements.
But I guess the bigger question is, do you think something has shifted when it comes to general audience interest in exactly these kinds of stories? Because I think something has.
Yeah, I do. And I would not be able to, write this book, write about the things I do, pack up and fly to North Dakota next week, if people were not more interested in this stuff, and if publications were not interested in paying me to write about this stuff. That said, I'm sitting here looking at faces of people who supported that work, including, of course, you, when very few people did want to do it. So, I still think that's really important because the mainstream media's attention is really, really short. And I was just talking to people, including Reverend Sekou, who I met on Grit TV, who are in Ferguson, in St. Louis, who are facing really serious charges now that the mainstream media's attention is gone. And talking about how we actually bring attention to that story because it's not dramatic and there's not like a bunch of people outside of the police department every night getting tear gassed by cops, and so the Washington Post no longer has a reporter there. And I mean, he's busy. There are plenty of other things for him to report on, but we're not talking about the aftermath of these things. And so, you know, the mainstream media's attention is coming to these things, but it's a question of still like whether we can sustain real coverage of them.
I should say that we will take questions from the audience soon-ish, and there are cards being distributed, or there will be, for people to write their questions on. So if you have a question, write it on a card, and we will get those answered by Sarah in just a bit. Connected to what you just said about how things are changing, one of the phenomena that you write about in the book is that happens often are simultaneous eruptions of millions of storms. Let me try to put this a different way. One of the things you describe in the book is the kind of eruption of comparable actions and activities in different parts of the country at the same time.
Right.
And people getting involved in campaigns that end up connecting, but started far away from each other. I'm thinking of some of our Walmart campaign activists who similarly got involved in a similar fight, but in different parts of the country before they came together. The same could be said of a lot of the movements that you describe. How do you explain some of that? And what role do you think, what plays a role in what makes a moment fertile for a movement?
I mean, if I could answer the like what's gonna explode, it would be I would be a more prescient reporter anyway, because it is interesting. It's a question of like many things when we talk about which police murder, which crackdown on activists, which particular issue in the many issues that were spun out by the financial crisis is going to actually get people going. We were talking last night about the Medicaid expansion, which is like the universally good part of the Affordable Care Act that really would save lives, and it's not expanding. And aside from Moral Mondays, there hasn't been that much attention paid to organizing around it. And yeah, I wish I could say that I have a better idea of how it's going to happen. But I think one of the things that we have now that we didn't have 10 years ago is, we have these things in our pockets, and people have little tiny video cameras and still cameras and broadcast journalism outlets in our back pockets at all times. And so these things can spread really fast, and they spread sort of in the shape of the internet. So they don't spread like you have to apply to be a member of an organization and whatever. They just sort of spread to different neighborhoods, and people hear about something happening on the internet, and they organize a protest in their neighborhood. And you put out a Facebook post, or now that Facebook is difficult and wants to charge you for everything, you find different ways to do that because, these companies that own these things. We could talk about that forever. I know particularly you can talk about that forever. But yeah.
But you do say in the book that the 2008 financial crisis, which for many people started way before 2008,
well, yes,
was created a fundamental shift. Or at least I feel that that's what you're saying in the book.
Yes.
How so?
I think, yeah, I mean, and the crisis did, of course, start well before 2008, but the 2008 crash was the acute crisis. And I've been using the terrible sort of gross metaphor of the frog in the pot of boiling water, and like we had sort of been there for years and years, right? That this had been going on for my lifetime. I'm 36, right? I was born in 1980. This is basically, Reagan. But this was the trajectory, right? Unions were on the way down. Inequality was on the way up. All of these things were happening. But in 2008, the bottom fell out. And it just and we were wondering if the banks were going to be nationalized and weird things that we don't talk about in this country. And I go back over and over to the Frederick Jameson line about it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. Well, it's not anymore, because in 2008 it nearly committed suicide. And we had to start thinking about that. And that I do think is why we see much more discussion of big, deep system change right now. I was talking about system change, not climate change, But and we were talking about Shama Sawant. We could talk about 12 million people voting for a guy from Vermont who calls himself a socialist. We are thinking about things in terms of big change, not just like we can elect a Democrat this fall and things will get better, because that also happened in 2008 and that also didn't really work.
So when you left Grit TV, you went and became a labor reporter.
I became a labor reporter.
A labor podcast.
I applied
Belabored.
for the job at Grit TV because Esther Kaplan at the Nation Institute told me that you are one of the best people out there covering labor. So
that was already your passion before.
it was already a thing I wanted to write about.
So some people might look at that and say, well, that was kind of retro.
It was definitely retro in 2008.
So talk about it. Why was that your passion, and why did you go ahead to then found Belabored, a labor-focused podcast?
I had a lot of lousy jobs.
Okay,
I did. I had a lot of lousy jobs before I met Laura.
Thanks for the clarification.
No. I worked. I finished college in 2002 in the middle of another recession, not quite as bad as the 2008 recession, which I finished grad school during. My timing is great, guys, and I got out of college thinking that, when I signed up to go to college in 1998, you sign on the dotted line for your student loan and you assume that you're going to get out and you assume that you're going to pay it all off because that's what you do, right? That's like how you get ahead, except it doesn't work that way anymore. And it really didn't work that way for me, partly because I have an English degree. And so I was waiting tables for years. And I was making $2.13 an hour and plus tips if, we were actually busy enough. And if we weren't busy enough, my boss would tell me to, scrape the gum off the underside of the table. And I'm like, $2.13 an hour, you know what you can do with that gum. And there was no restaurant opportunity center in Denver when I was doing that. They were just getting started here in New York at that time. And I was going, what do I do about this? What do people who are in this situation do? It's really different when you're looking at waiting tables as like your summer job in between semesters in college, and when you're looking at this and going, this could be my life. And I think that plays into the post-2008 situation if we talk about like how many jobs lost since the financial crisis were mid-wage jobs and how many of the jobs regained since are low-wage service jobs. These things look very different when they're going to be your life. And when they're going to be your life, you have two options. You are just going to accept that you're going to be miserable, or you do something to change it. And so when we look around now and see all of this activism, all of this organizing, all of this like willingness to go on strike and risk your job, or sit down in a Walmart and risk arrest over your low-wage job, it's because like what's next if you quit that low-wage job is another low-wage job.
So how central is labor to the upsurge, the revolt that you're reporting on? What role does it play?
I think it's central. And I think that, when we look at, I just mentioned the fight for 15 an hour Walmart, but we're also talking about Wisconsin, which I mentioned before. And that was, in February of 2011, the only thing the media wanted to talk about was a Tea Party. That was like the only game in town. And then all of a sudden, people in Wisconsin are taking over their state capital over the issue of like collective bargaining for teachers and social workers. And I didn't think that was going to happen. Speaking of many things that I didn't think was going to happen, and I remember sitting in the office here while you were in Wisconsin talking to people, in the Capitol, shooting at the WORT studios. Oh, I remember that. And like going, this is something. Again, one of many moments where it was like, this is.
And one of the things it was a coming together of old labor and new movements. The
right.
people that occupied that capital were young people of color. A lot of them, the teaching assistants that you wrote
TAA
about.
right there on your notes.
Teaching assistants. And then Wisconsin having its traditional labor movement. And that was a fascinating kind of blend. And it's a blend that you write about a lot in the book or talk about. And, I feel like we're painting a lot of pictures here because they're not painted well in our mass media. A lot of people here are probably familiar with all these intersections. But one of the questions I would have for you, who've been following this more recently than I, was how do you think the labor movement has changed in face of this upsurge?
I mean, a friend of mine who up until recently was working in the AFL-CIO office in Washington was like literally talking about it as like trying to turn around the Titanic. Like in the last, since 1934 or so, the labor movement has become a set of very big, very, still powerful institutions that are really hard to change quickly. And yet, anybody who is paying attention to the world outside in the labor movement, and this is like top level to, ground level organizers, is thinking about this, is thinking about how do we do this differently, is thinking about how do we grapple with Black Lives Matter and how do we talk about this when we also have members who are police officers, is thinking about like what lessons can we take from this to make, for instance, the Verizon strike a success, which was a bigger success than anybody thought that was going to be also. And, we should mention that right before Occupy Wall Street, the Verizon workers had also just been on strike and went back without a contract. And, it was a pretty, crushing loss back then. And this summer, they won most of their demands from you probably know better than I do the actual size of Verizon in terms of media corporations these days, but it's a massive, massive company, and they gave the workers basically most of what they wanted. And so, it's still hard. It's still frustrating for a lot of people who are trying to make the labor movement change faster and adapt faster. But it's a thing that labor is grappling with in a way that is, we should be real about the fact that like labor got a big reprieve this year when Scalia died. We could be sitting here talking about a world in which public sector workers are all right to work. That could easily have happened. And it didn't because one right-wing justice picked the correct time to die. And that's not a thing you want to hang your future on. And I'm really, really hoping that labor is hanging its future on more than just the results of the election this fall.
Well, what about more than 15 an hour? 15 an hour is great. It was a radical demand when you started writing the book. It's now sort of reality. But it is not socialism in our lifetime, and it is not a living wage in lots of parts of this country. So what next?
It is not socialism in our time, but it took a socialist to make it happen. And that should tell us something. No, I was actually just in Seattle a few weeks ago, and I was talking to some of the folks from Socialist Alternative about what they're working on now, and some of the people who had been involved in the $15 an hour campaign in Seattle and in SeaTac, Washington, which was actually the first place to win it. And the big thing that they're working on now also is scheduling. In addition to fighting, like the city putting $100 million or something into a special police station that is like, there's a massive homelessness crisis in Seattle, like there is in most major cities right now. So they're fighting on that, they're fighting housing, they're fighting for some sort of rent control or rent regulation laws like the ones we're desperately hanging on to here in New York City. But they're also fighting for a safe scheduling, or a sane scheduling law. I keep calling it safe scheduling, which would give workers some control over their time, which is a thing that I think is a really fascinating front for the labor movement that it's only starting to dip its toe back into after, the 8-hour day movement being the main focus of the labor movement for something like 100 years.
Do people know what this whole fight around flex time scheduling, so-called flex time, is? Like on-demand workers now?
Yeah, so we're talking about a lot of different things when we talk about these scheduling bills. They are often a collection of different things. So they would restrict things like what they call clopenings, which was a big piece in the Times about Starbucks workers who like have to close the store at, 2 in the morning or whenever it is that they actually get out, and then go right back in the morning at 6 a.m. But it's also about things like you have to get your schedule a week in advance. So your boss can't call you the next day and say, you have to come in at 8 this morning, and if you don't, you're fired. And never mind if you have a kid that you have to find childcare for, things like that. And so these are fights that are not just about money, but are about actually like how do you have some sort of a quality of life control, even if you're in a job that has not been deemed fancy and worthy by, years and years of hype, basically, and years of organizing. So when we think about time, though, I think that this is a really important front for labor to pick up on, and this is not in this book as much as maybe it could be, but it'll be in the next one, I promise. If enough of you buy this one, that I get to write another one. Katie's smiling at me back there. And so time is the question when we talk about, the last time I was here, we were talking about this actually, it was John Nichols. Time is the question when we talk about distribution of work, right? When we talk about continued high unemployment and then also people who are working 50 hours a week or working 2 jobs or things like that. Like if we actually distribute the work among people and we all worked a little bit less, that would actually help solve some of those problems. And time is just an issue when we talk about having the right to live as people and not having to work all the time. And yeah, so I think it's a
Time for what we will. What did they demand?
Exactly, 8 hours for, well, right now we need to, 8 hours was 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago. So I think
8 hours for work, 8 hours
for rest,
sleep,
and 8 hours for what we will.
8 hours for what we will. That was before you were renting your apartment and renting your car.
And right, and driving
leasing
for
out all
Uber,
your free time.
and yeah, so. And when we still have, continued high unemployment and a lot of people who don't have jobs at all.
Where do you come down on this discussion between kind of cultural, culture versus economics? Like there are people who look at the, for lack of a better example, the Donald Trump folks and say, well, they're just misguided good working class people and the racism is a detail. And if we just organize them, they would come over to our side, not unlike the discussion that we had, many of us, around the Tea Party. Is culture just kind of a wedge issue to divide the working class, in your view?
I mean, racism has always been used to divide the working class. That's a very old, historical fact. It's also true that, like, the way racism and sexism affect people is economic. That, like, if I get pregnant tomorrow, I have terrible Affordable Care Act health insurance, and I don't have a stable, I have a baseline income, but I'm a freelancer, so it goes up and down. And if I were to consider having a child, that would be a huge, major economic impact on my life. That's not just like a cultural thing that I want to have a child or not have a child. Like, we don't have a functional childcare system in this country. We don't have we still don't really have a functional education system, although there are a lot of people fighting for that we could talk about plenty more.
We always said
nobody
ever called it a social issue who lost their job for getting pregnant.
Right, and when we're talking, we're talking to people in Ferguson, they were talking about the fact that when you get arrested or you get pulled over and you get a $100 ticket or something that you can't pay, and then you're saddled with court fees on top of that, and then they bring you in, and then they charge you for being in jail, and then suddenly you have these people who have like $1,200 in charges and are spending 3 weeks in jail. It's like, what is that? Like, the city was running on court fees and fines. That is extracting wealth from the 70-something% of Ferguson that was black. That's like that is what's happening here. When we talk about the financial crisis, we can't talk about it without talking about predatory loans that put black and Latino people into subprime loans, even when white people with the same credit and the same income got into regular loans. So we can talk about, predatory sales of second mortgages to, Kai Wright, I quote this one all the time too, who was on Grit TV talking about this, about an article he'd written about Atlanta, and the way that the predatory lenders came into people who, mostly older black people who had no low incomes but had a house and sold them second mortgages. And then suddenly the financial crisis, and you're underwater on your home that you didn't owe money on until they sold you a second mortgage to pay for your other bills. These are racism, these are sexism, these are economic issues as well. This is all connected, and I don't understand why it's so hard to talk about it.
But we've had decades of being told you either fight on the economic issues or you fight on the so-called identity politics issues. Are you suggesting in your book here that people are finding a way to blend or to not get hung up on this crazy divide?
I am saying that if we read the Vision for Black Lives platform that came out in August, and you look at the demands in there, they are demands for universal health care, and they are demands for charter schools to get out of our public school system. They are also demands for reparations. All of these are, in fact, economic demands that on some levels are universal, on other levels are very specific ways to redress racism in this country and the legacy of racism in this country. And the fact that like people are still fighting about it on Twitter just kind of annoys me, because I'm like, we've gotten past it, guys, really, I swear.
So I've got like 3 more questions, and I'd love to get questions from the audience. Some of the questions that I think I've heard relating to movements over the years are things like, well, what can I do? Like, what's the most important thing for me to do right now? So I'm going to ask you that question, because otherwise somebody else might ask it. And
The most important thing for you to do right now, Laura.
No, the most important thing for, I think, people who are not involved. I mean, this question of what is solidarity, what is taking action. When we talk about so many people in movement, I think people get overwhelmed.
Yeah.
Like if it's a multi-issue problem, how do I take an action on anything?
Yeah.
Do I have to go get involved in the North Dakota pipeline, or can I do something here? If Black Lives Matter, then what about wages? How do you suggest people get themselves involved if they're not, like the people in this room probably?
I mean, I assume the people in this room are all involved in everything.
Right, they're probably all involved.
Right, but like, I think the wonderful thing about right now is that there's a million things going on all the time. And so it's not that hard. I mean, it's certainly not that hard in New York. Like, this is unfair because I'm in New York City. But like, there's a lot going on everywhere. And the real question of how you find it is still, that this is our job as the media, is to tell people what's going on that they maybe don't know about already. But yeah, I mean, I don't think I can tell anybody what the most important thing for them to get involved in. I think it's a question of what's the most important thing to you and what's happening where you are. Like, what's the most important thing in the place where you live? If you live in North Dakota, it might be this pipeline blockade. It still might not be to you. It might be your job. It might be something else. If you live in New York City, it might be the fact that your landlord is probably trying to raise your rent. If your landlord's not trying to raise your rent, you probably live at like the top end of the housing market, because I hear that is like overflowing now, and people are giving away free rents if you can pay $4,000 a month for an apartment or something. If there's something that directly affects you, then awesome. If there's not something that is so direct that you're looking around going like, how do I connect? I don't know, what does make, what is it that gets you going, right? I think that there's so much going on, there's so much wrong that like the fact that there are so many problems that need to be fixed that I would feel like such a jerk being like, no, you need to get involved in this thing right now. Like, I can't make that decision for people, but I think that we need more trouble, as I was saying before.
As a reporter covering these issues, how do you grapple with your own relationship to the movements that you're covering?
Yeah, that's a question. I mean, right, like the first question is also deciding what to cover, right? Because there are so many things going on at any given time, and am I going to spend money to go to North Dakota? Yes.
But I guess I mean that you're covering movements that don't get a lot of coverage, so do you feel a responsibility to cover them positively, to air all the dirty laundry? Like, where do you draw the line as a reporter?
Those are the real questions that are like, there's no answer to that. It's just like a daily struggle, and if you're not struggling with it, then I think you're probably a lazy reporter. I think that everybody who covers this stuff struggles with that every day. I think that we have an obligation to be honest about how victories actually come about, because you can't replicate them if you don't know how that worked. So like, yes, workers went on strike in New York repeatedly, and there was a lot of political pressure on Andrew Cuomo to go for $15 an hour. Also, he had this investigation hanging over his head, and that's part of it. And we should be honest about that and not solely just say that like workers went on strike and then magic happened. I think we should be honest about things like that. I think we should be honest about things that lose, right? When Scott Walker is still governor, what happened? Mm-hmm. What was the problem there? What didn't work? Because we can't win if we don't think about how we lost. And yeah, I think that this is, I think I try to just actually respect people which sounds like a really obvious thing to say, but I think that actually a lot of reporters don't respect people who don't have a long list of accomplishments after their name, or a long list of accomplishments that maybe they don't know after their name, right? That's my favorite, actually. But yeah, I wish I had like clear sets of rules on this subject, because
It's tricky.
just don't. But it's a thing that we
grapple with it.
we all fight with,
Do,
because
do you include the Trump people in your Americans in Revolt?
yes.
Not in the book so much, but in the moment of today?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I tried to find J.D. Meadows. I tried so hard to find him, and
Who's a Tea Partier.
his email. He is the Tea Partier who begins the book, who was on Grit TV. I had, the email address that we had when he was on the show didn't work. His business website had disappeared. I don't know what happened to him. Because I wanted to ask him,
Yeah,
right? I wanted to know where he was now. I really wanted to say, like, what are you doing? Did you look when Occupy happened and think like, oh, my things I'm angry about fit in there? Like, when I talked to Debbie Dooley, who I did not get to the part of the climate change chapter where I circle back to her, but she's a Tea Partier in Atlanta who then started this thing called the Green Tea Party. And she's like picking fights with the Koch brothers over solar energy, because she wants solar energy. And yeah, she's a fascinating person, because she's a deeply, deeply conservative person who's on the board of the Tea Party Patriots or whatever it is. But she is also, worked in solidarity with some friends of mine who are Teamster organizers and Occupy Atlanta over an anti-picketing, anti-protest bill that was put forward when Occupy Atlanta was in. And they all came together and basically said this would crack down on all of our rights to protest, and we think that that's garbage and would like you to quash this bill, please. And they won. And so, I don't want to be all kumbaya and the left and right are going to get together and everything's going to be great, because I don't think that's true. I think they're very specific issues of power and just solutions to problems that I think won't work. But, my parents are Republicans. I dedicated this book to them. They came to see me in Atlanta. And, after dinner, my mother's like, we're not as far apart as you think. I'm like, please don't vote for Trump. But, it's...
Who are they going to vote for?
I don't know. They're in South Carolina. My mother voted for Ross Perot back in whatever it was, 92, and has been very angry ever since about throwing away her vote. And so she kind of votes the Republican Party line, and they really don't like Hillary Clinton. So
I think we hear how they're going to vote.
I
So how are you, last question for me, then we'll go to audience. How are you personally approaching this election? You've said it's not the most important thing. You've said it's
trying
not
to
the
pay as
be-all
full
and
attention to it as
end-all.
possible.
But I can only imagine it's coming up everywhere you go.
It's coming up everywhere I go. And I think the way I actually just got into a very long argument about this last night after my book event was over. I think the way I'm approaching this election is to the only election stories that I wrote were about down ballot races. I wrote one from Lawyers and Company about New York State Senate and a couple of congressional races and the amount of big money that is going to come flooding into these things. And I have another piece that's in the works at The Nation on Zephyr Teachout, and I am on strike from the presidential race because I just don't think that that's where we make change anyway. I think that that's the reverse. That said, y'all, 12 million people voted for a socialist. Something happened this year. And so I continue to find all of this fascinating, but I wrote a piece for the Washington Post about how, the Bernie Sanders campaign is over and the political revolution is not, because it didn't start with Bernie Sanders.
It used to be that the Republican Party was always very good at co-opting. It's the people at its margins, usually the pro voters, the people at the margin of the party, and bringing them inside, whether it was the Tea Party or whatever. And the Democrats would do the reverse.
Kick
If
them out.
Ralph Nader, the environmentalists, whomever, they would kick them out.
Yeah.
Has anything shifted on that front?
I mean, I think that there is a really fascinating tension on this front. We saw the Democratic National Convention have the Mothers of the Movement night. They didn't offer any actual policy that
It was
would have
all
made
mothers
those
and no
women's
movement, as I remember.
Right. They did not offer any actual policies that would have made any of those women's sons still alive. But they put them on stage, and that's something that they're acknowledging, that this is a significant movement, that like even though, you know, the Blue Lives Matter crowd would like to say that it's not and it's just hooligans, like the fact that, you know, that a Clinton Democratic National Convention put them on stage is something.
And they put Reverend Barber
They put Reverend Barber on. Everybody loves Reverend Barber, though, and we didn't even talk about this at all. But like Reverend Barber is the one person who comes out of this whole maelstrom of stuff that is legible to people because he's like a civil rights leader, and they know what to think of that.
Except
right?
at the convention, he said the word Palestine, which is not what you get from civil rights leaders typically
I mean,
on platforms like the DNC.
yeah, that's certainly not the thing. But it's, you know, it's a question of like, how can they absorb some of this? But at the same time, like Hillary Clinton also chose Tim Kaine as her running mate, so there's also, you know, there's still the like push-pull, like we're gonna pay just enough lip service to this that we can then like scold you for not getting in line.
All right, questions from you all. I could keep chatting with Sarah for a long time.
Probably forever.
We didn't even talk about David Bowie or shoes. Come on.
We can talk about those things.
All right, 2 questions. Pick either. They are both dumb.
They are not dumb.
They are not dumb. Well, I guess we'll find out. Why direct action? Question 1. 2, thinking about the white man, you something. For many of the white working class, is racial resentment more powerful or more compelling than class consciousness? Thinking about the white man you mentioned, the Mississippi man.
JD.
Mississippi man,
Yeah.
JD Meadows. Is racial resentment more powerful or more compelling than class consciousness?
I mean, I would like to answer that question in a moment where we've actually had a movement of people who are trying to organize the JD Meadowses and failing.
Yeah.
Because at this moment, nobody's trying. That some of them are probably not. For some people, it probably is more. I don't know who asked that question, so I'm like trying to make eye contact with somebody. But yeah, for some people, I think it is going to be. It's going to be the solution. It's the answer. It's who you blame. For other people, I hope not. I live in hope, but I think at this moment we have not seen enough of an attempt to actually organize in places like Ripley, Mississippi, to give people like JD somebody to find who isn't the Council of Conservative Citizens. What was the other question?
And the other question was why direct action?
Because elections are broken. And I spend a lot of time in this actually in the book, which we just didn't really talk about here, but I think we've seen the rise in action at the same time as we've seen the like massively dropping voter turnout numbers, and I don't think that's an accident. People are looking at Congress and going, well, they don't do anything anyway. First of all, like when was the last time they passed a bill, other than to name a post office? I don't remember. Like I literally don't remember. And yeah, so we're looking at a political system that just like doesn't work, and when it does work, it's only to pass things that are for the tiny percent, like the 1/10 of 1%, as our friend Stephen Lerner says. And so when you're looking at that and you're looking at your life needs changing, how do you then actually change it? What do you do? How do you actually stop business as usual and say, my life is unbearable. Our lives as a group are unbearable. We need to make things different. And you jerks in DC are not listening to us.
I think there's another aspect to it, too, if I may. Yeah. The argument about why commit it can have lots of different answers. And one of them is we're recovering this pipeline in a way we weren't before the Standing Rock standoff began. So that's one of the arguments about why to do it, to get the attention, to make the difference. But I think your book also speaks to why to do it because of the way that it builds movement. And the lasting effect of having been engaged in that kind of risk-taking activity with fellows who you might not have met before. I think that you write about people who were involved in Occupy who were never the same again afterwards. Certainly people who were involved in the Wisconsin-Madison occupation were never the same afterwards. So there is both a kind of why to do it from the before you do it, and then there's a kind of why to do it for after.
Yeah,
what you're left with in terms of legacy and relationship, and your description of the response to Storm Sandy with Occupy Sandy, I think spoke to that. The people who hadn't known each other at all had a phone tree, had people they trusted. It seems to me a critical part of movement building, and it's not just about the goal that the action was destined, or, was organized around.
Yeah, I think the best, I'm flipping to this page in my book because I love it so much that I'm just going to read it to you. The best description of it was from Toby Chow, who is from the People's Lobby in Chicago, and they were talking about Moral Monday, Illinois. And he says, I think there's a few aspects to civil disobedience. One is if you're willing to risk an arrest, you're going to be able to more effectively shut something down. That's crucial because part of what we want to do by staging these direct actions is to generalize the crisis. The politicians and these rich people who are funding them, they're imposing this crisis on a vast majority of people, but as far as they're concerned, there is no crisis. It's not part of their life. He continues, it's a form of self-assertion that really transforms the people who go through with it. Once you cross that line and say, no, I'm not going to leave when the police tell me to leave, and if they have to carry me away, then they're going to carry me away. It expands your sense of freedom about what you're willing to do and what you're capable of doing. It has a really liberating effect on people. And so I'm just going to keep quoting Toby on that because he's
How many
he's way
people in
better
the
than I
room
could.
have been involved in direct action? Committed, it sounds like something criminal. Yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, probably. We'd recommend it. I get the reluctance, another question. I get the reluctance of progressives to vote for Clinton, but for so many reasons. But isn't it possible to vote for Clinton without giving up more fundamental struggles? Is it an
Yes.
either or?
No, it's not an either or. I don't think that who you vote for in November makes much of a difference on, well, that's not true. I think if you vote for Donald Trump, you probably need to re-examine your priorities. But I think that you can, I think you can go out and you vote for who you feel compelled to vote for. That is what you think the solution is. And you can still go out the next day and organize with people who voted for somebody else. We live in New York State. We live in if Hillary Clinton loses New York, then we're screwed anyway. So y'all can basically vote for whoever you want in this state. But I don't think that I just don't think that voting in November is a litmus test of whether you are a movement participant or not.
All right, so very quickly, when we got together in 2008, following the election of Obama, the main thing we said was, what are we going to inaugurate? What are we, the social movements, going to inaugurate? We went down, we covered the inauguration. That was our question. The point was, how do movements stay on a Democratic candidate, when they're in the White House? And we saw them mostly not stay on the candidate, not on the administration. Is anything going to be different this time, given all these Americans in revolt that you document?
I think so.
Okay, very good.
Really hope so. I mean, yeah, in 2008, you had two things, right? One, you had lost this hellacious Republican administration that was carrying on these wars that are still going on. And there was all of this energy had gone into, we need to find the Democrat who's going to end these wars and get us out of this moment, and we elect this guy, and then the economy falls apart. And we're sitting there going this is the opportunity for the Democrats to be the New Deal party again, and remember all of these articles about this, and that sure didn't happen. And there was, partly shock and partly a grace period, and I don't think we're in either of those moments right now. We're in a moment where, people were interrupting Bernie Sanders on stage and not giving even the furthest left candidate in the race a chance, or a chance. They give him plenty of chances, but not even assuming that this guy is our hero, but we need to push everyone, no matter who they are, no matter what side they say they're on. And so we've seen protests. We saw protests of Bernie Sanders. We've seen protests of, certainly of Hillary Clinton, protests of Donald Trump, and more protests of Donald Trump, and more protests of Donald Trump, and hopefully still more protests of Donald Trump. And yeah, I think we're in a totally different space than we were in 2008 for many reasons, which is...
All right, so hope springs eternal. And not just hope, plans.
Not just hope, organizing.
Plans need to spring eternal. All right, 2 last questions. Can institutional/political change be catalyzed by a single switch in policy? In which case, which one would it be, in your opinion?
I don't think things are catalyzed by switches in policy. I think things are catalyzed by people who then make switches in policy happen.
Whoever asked that question, was that a good answer?
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know that there's just, I would love to know what that is, but I don't know that there's just one. I think that, on some levels, like a higher minimum wage allows people to have a little bit more, freedom to cause trouble, but also, you're still afraid of losing your job. You still don't have control over your schedule. You still have to find childcare.
Defense of the right to organize might be good.
I mean, defense of the right to organize would be great. I feel like there's like a collection of things that we could like put together, like a package of things that might work, which like, universal health care and child care and, increased wages and, some sort of actual, definition of the length of the working week. And like, you could put together a package of things that would then in turn like build people's capacity. But, we also saw that when we got the New Deal, like that didn't actually make people start organizing more. It actually made people go like, okay, we can like live with this. And that was, again, we can talk about the labor movement in particular in that moment, but there was sort of a agreement to deal with this. And then what labor found out 30 years later is that the bosses never stopped trying to get rid of them.
Well, that speaks to another question here. Thanks, Elizabeth. Another question here about your theory of change. Because the system instills us all with the notion that the vote will bring about change and it doesn't, and revolt, on the other hand, is punished, how is real change possible?
I mean, real change is possible in a variety of ways. And I think, I don't think that presidential elections are the solution. I think in presidential election years, it just becomes this like awful 2-year hype cycle of like the most important thing you will ever do in your life every 4 years is this vote in November. And if you don't vote for the Democrat, the world is going to explode. And that's every single year. That said, like, you can do actually pretty impressive things on like a local election level when if you can elect a Shama Sawant, if you can elect a whoever else. But that's also not enough. If you are talking about, what is real change? Is real change a $15 an hour minimum wage? That's like a real change in the lives of people who are making less than $15 an hour. It's not enough. It's not the solution. If I knew how to actually, snap my fingers and bring about socialism, I'd probably be an organizer and not a journalist. But I think that's change happens when enough people make it impossible to ignore, whatever that ends up being. I know that sounds like a cop-out answer. I wish I had a better one that, that like was like, you need this many pitchforks and this many people to march in the street. And I don't have that kind of an answer. I wish I did.
I think it's also worth thinking about our image of change also, right? Like we think, oh, change happened on Thursday. Change is an ongoing project. This is a long-term project, and
I
we
think we talk about like change in this way that, we talked about like the Obama, like hopey changey, whatever. Like change is a nebulous thing. Like if Donald Trump gets elected, that's change. It's not good change. But also like but also some of the things that Donald Trump is proposing are not actually that big a change, right. Not as big a change as a lot of people would like us to pretend they are. Like there's already a border fence, guys. There are drones that cost, I have the actual number of how much the drones cost actually in this book, that fly along the border all the time, that we have a heavily militarized border already. And so, when we think about change and how it happens and like what it is that we want to change, I think like it's more than just saying change that I want to think about. I want to think about like what does power look like and how do we have that? And we have that when we can stop the way that things are going that is intolerable to people and make it go another way. And that is...
So we have a question about things that are intolerable, and I thank the person that asked this question. This year, a young Black Lives Matter activist in Ohio, Marshawn McCarroll, committed suicide in front of the Ohio State House. Before he fatally shot himself, he wrote on his Facebook page, "My demons won today, I'm sorry."
Yeah.
Mental illness is an issue still with fierce stigma attached. If that affects workers and activists, did you meet anyone with mental illness? How did they cope with it? And what did a social movement mean for them?
Yeah, I did not know Marshawn, but I knew a lot of people who did, and that was it's really hard. This is like when you are getting tear gassed by the police, who even if you never thought that the police were your friends, you still kind of didn't think they were going to tear gas you in the coffee shop that is your safe space. And people are dealing with real trauma. People are also, I mentioned people, dealing with these extended prison sentences, but also like people are dealing with mental illness because we don't have a functional healthcare system in the society. People are dealing with it because the trauma that they're going through, whether that be the trauma of like losing their home or they're, losing another job, not being able to pay the bills, or the trauma that you go through by actually getting involved in these movements. And like, this is so real. And it's why it's one of the reasons I say that like universal healthcare is kind of a necessary thing to, building to the next level, because people are, Marshawn is not the only one. Yeah. And that's real. And it's not, again, it's not a question I have an answer to, but this question, which I met a lot of people who are struggling with PTSD, with various, with depression, with all sorts of mental health issues, and are trying to figure out how to take care of each other within the movement, and how to take care of themselves and their families outside of it. Some people step back. Some people say, I can't do this anymore right now. I have to go home and I have to take care of myself. And other people, try to come up with ways that within their group, within their organization, they can help take care of each other. And then, Marshawn McCarroll, and that it really, really shook a lot of people who had been organizing with him.
One of the things that I found most poignant over the summer really was going to the Republican National Convention in Cleveland and getting a chance to interview the mother of Tanisha Anderson, one of the women who was actually killed by the police immediately before Tamir Rice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
30 days or 10 days before Tamir Rice, and their family very much believe if there'd been attention given to what happened to her, she was left on the grass verge outside her house having a breakdown. Her mother said, we're all of us on a continuum of mental health.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, well, she pointed at the Republican convention. You want to say they're saying?
No,
but she said, we're not talking about the right things. We're not talking about how do we look after one another. How do we stop killing one another? Yeah. That's what's driving so many of us. And that's what the conversation is that we need to push forward. And I'm happy for us to continue this conversation for as long as people want, but I want also to let you have an end. And I just want to really thank you for this book that really does lift up the conversations that we need to be having, asks really good questions, follows really important movements. And I hope that Necessary Trouble produces more necessary trouble, and that you get to keep on writing and doing the work that you're doing. I've always had a regret that our independent media movement has not succeeded in creating the kind of pipeline that I wish we had to make it easy for reporters like Sarah to thrive and find a home and find a way to keep doing this work. But you found a way, and I want to thank all the people that have made it possible, and thank all of you who support independent media, and encourage you to buy the book, sign the book. She's selling right over here with real money. It's a real book. You can pick up our bookmark as a gift. But Sarah, thank you for the work and thank you for the book.
I don't have an end because it's all still ongoing. So thank you.
Necessary Sarah.
Well.